On September 11, 2001, nearly 3,000 innocent Americans were intentionally murdered. Over 1,000 soldiers have died and thousands more have been maimed or wounded. We dedicate this video to their memory and to the capture, trial, and punishment of those responsible. Please join us in a prayer or moment of silence in tribute to them. In its final report, the 9/11 Commission ignored the following significant facts and questions that conflict with that report's conclusions. Why did a third skyscraper at the World Trade Center that was not hit inexplicably collapse? Building 7 at the World Trade Center was never hit by an airplane and had no significant fire. It was 47 stories high. It was constructed of steel. Yet at 5:30 p.m. it fell perfectly straight down into a small pile of rubble, just like a controlled demolition. Why did the Federal Emergency Management Agency lament that the specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown? Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of Building 7 who collected insurance of $7 billion, is on tape saying he ordered the New York Fire Department to pull it, to destroy the building with explosives. In October of 2001, Scientific American told us that they just don't build them as tough as the World Trade Center. Considering that Meridian Plaza in Philadelphia burned fiercely for 19 hours yet never collapsed, how could the South Tower at the World Trade Center fall after burning less than 1 hour? How could the North Tower fall after burning only for 2? How could the jet fuel have caused the collapse when the Federal Emergency Management and other government agencies have stated that most of the jet fuel was gone in the initial fireball? Moreover, how could the fires have caused the collapse at all, since recent fire tests by Cardington found that a steel building survived fires in experiments with extreme temperatures beyond the range possible with jet fuel? Since the black smoke coming from the buildings means that the fire was oxygen-starved and could not have reached its maximum temperature of 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and steel melts at a much higher temperature of 2500 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 700 degrees hotter than the maximum temperature of the fire, how could cleanup crews have found melted steel in the basements? How could, days later, NASA satellite images show hot spots in the buildings that still exceeded the maximum temperatures possible? Explosives like C4, however, create temperatures of 3000 degrees Fahrenheit, which easily melt steel. Why did Fire Engineering magazine tell us that no steel building has ever been destroyed by fire, that the World Trade Center investigation was a half-baked farce? Why was all of the important evidence illegally destroyed, some before the investigation began? Why was $40 million spent to investigate Clinton's sex life while only $600,000 was spent on investigating the World Trade Center fires and subsequent collapse? Why did the entire 9/11 Commission spend only $15 million while expenditures on Clinton's lies exceeded $65 million? How could the airliner's impact have caused the collapse when wind gusts from storms had at times been greater than the impact of the airliners? Neither tower was bent, nor did they creak or groan at any time. Firefighters said they seemed sound and reported that there were no fires they couldn't control. How could the building collapse at the maximum speed of gravity? Each floor hit should have slowed the fall, just as if you drop a steel ball from the roof, it would fall faster without resistance. This couldn't have happened without explosives placed inside the structure. How could the concrete encased in a steel-framed pan with 2 layers of carpet over it, riveted inside columns of steel beams, welded together in a network with steel bands, be pulverized? How could steel beams and clouds of finely pulverized concrete come shooting out of the buildings at hundreds of miles an hour, traveling all the way to New Jersey? This is only possible with explosives. The buildings fell rapidly, according to the 9/11 Commission, because the bolts, rivets, and steel framework were weakened by the fire. If so, Then how could the concrete be pulverized and ejected at high speed, since the force to do that is greater than the force needed to shear the weakened steel, bolts, and rivets? How could the Twin Towers fall straight down when the damage and resulting fires were only to one corner, two sides? Only the tops of the Twin Towers should have fallen, and they should have fallen over, not straight down. In fact, the top of one tower did fall over onto Building 4, so there was no building weight to crush the floors below. So what caused the collapse of those floors? How could a hijacker find and hit the Pentagon whose flight instructor said, "I'm still to this day amazed that he could have flown into the Pentagon. He could not fly at all"? How could a pilot this bad have the flight controllers comment, "The steep turn was so smooth, it's clear there was no fight for control going on"? The complex maneuver suggests the hijackers had better flying skills than many investigators first believed. Why did NORAD fail to stop the attackers 4 times on September 11, 2001? 3 times after they knew the planes were hijacked and intent on mass murder. How could this happen when NORAD had successfully intercepted off-course and suspected hijackings 67 times during the year prior to 9/11, according to the Associated Press on August 13, 2002? Why did Condoleezza Rice lie that the U.S. had no idea that terrorists would use hijacked airliners when Richard Cheney was commanding war games on 9/11, chasing phantom hijacked aircraft? Why were our Air Force planes diverted from intercepting the real hijacked airplanes? Isn't it too much of a coincidence that the 4 hijacked aircraft had only 20% of their seats filled, while all other transcontinental flights that day had 70 to 90% of their seats occupied? Why did the New York Times not publish the results of a Zogby poll which showed that 66% of New Yorkers want the 9/11 investigation reopened? This poll also found that 49% thought that VIPs in the government knew ahead of time and let it happen. Thus, the final report does or will not answer many important questions and has many inaccuracies. Senator Mark Dayton of Minnesota officially complained.
And their commission testimony 20 months later covered up those truths. They lied to the American people, they lied to Congress, and they lied to your 9/11 Commission.
Senator Dayton gave a few examples of the lies that NORAD told the official inquiry.
NORAD issued an official chronology which stated that the FAA notified NORAD of the second hijacking at 8:43. Wrong. FAA notified NORAD of the third hijacking at 9:24, according to your report. Wrong. FAA notified NORAD of the fourth hijacking at an unspecified time, and that prior to the crash in Pennsylvania, Langley F-16 Combat Air Patrol planes were in place, remaining in place to protect Washington, D.C. All untrue.
He pointed out that the Commission's report actually admits that NORAD lied, in effect, committing perjury.
And in that testimony before you, NORAD officials stated also that at 9:24 they received notice of the hijacking of the third plane, American Flight 77. Also untrue, according to your report. But what I find much more shocking and alarming were the repeated and catastrophic failures of the leaders in charge and the other people responsible to do their jobs, to follow established procedures, to follow direct orders from civilian and military commanders. And then they failed to tell us the truth later.
Just one example of their extreme incompetence is that NORAD sent our fighter jets in the wrong direction.
NORAD Missioner Commander ordered his only 3 other planes on alert in Virginia to scramble and fly north to Baltimore. Minutes later, when he was told that a plane was approaching Washington, he learned that the planes were flying east over the Atlantic Ocean, away from Baltimore and Washington. So that when the third plane struck the Pentagon, NORAD's fighters were 150 miles away, farther than they were before they took off. This is just unbelievable negligence.
Some people dismiss these numerous acts of blatant incompetence while our nation was under attack as innocent mistakes. However, Senator Dayton pointed out that if we allow government officials to lie to us, and if we allow them to falsify documents, and if we allow them to be unbelievably, grossly negligent, it doesn't matter how many laws we pass or how much money we spend on commissions or investigations.
And we can set up all of the oversight possible at great additional cost to the American taxpayers, and it won't be worth an Enron pension if the people responsible lie to us. If they take their records and doctor them into falsehoods, and if they get away with it.
Senator Dayton is just one of the many skeptics complaining about the incompetence, the doctored reports, the lies, the cover-up. There are millions of people around the world who are disappointed with this dismal failure of the American government to protect us. Theodore Roosevelt warned us. To announce that there must be no criticism of the President, or that we are to stand by the President right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, it is morally treasonable to the American public. Let's begin by looking at the news reports about the September 11th attack. Some events on September 11th were either ignored altogether or mentioned only briefly. As we mentioned before, Building 7 was a 47-story skyscraper with a hard steel frame. It was almost half the height of the towers. This building collapsed at 5:30 p.m. in the evening. However, this news report was never repeated. Most people still do not even know this building existed, let alone that it collapsed. Military officials told reporters that they did not have any video of the airplane crashing into the Pentagon. News reports show only the fires and rubble from the crash, rather than the airplane as it crashes. News reports tell us that the FBI confiscated security camera tapes from the gas station and hotel across the street and other nearby buildings that show the airplane flying toward the Pentagon. Within a few days, the FBI released the names and photos of the alleged 19 hijackers. Yet, news reports point out that some of these alleged hijackers are still alive and well in Saudi Arabia, although some reports disagree on which hijackers are still alive. The FBI has not removed the mistakes from their list. We never saw Flight 77 crash into the Pentagon because military officials said there were no photos or video of that event. The early drawings turned out to be incorrect, such as this one from U.S. News and World Report, in which the airplane is diving toward the helicopter pad. As a result, many people still incorrectly believe that the plane caused the roof to collapse when it was really just the fire. This computer simulation follows the official theory that Flight 77 flew a few inches above the grass and crashed into the ground floor. The pilot in a 757 is about 55 feet above and forward of the engines. It would take Superman skills to fly so close to the ground at 400 miles per hour. Just imagine trying to drive your car 400 miles per hour between the two irregular concrete walls inches from the sides. Moreover, since the pilot could only see one engine, he would not even be able to see how close the passenger side is to the wall and obstructions. Originally, the FBI claimed the terrorist who flew this plane was an experienced pilot for a Saudi Arabian airline, but they switched their claim to an inexperienced pilot after discovering he was still alive in Saudi Arabia. Regardless of whether it was an expert pilot or not, experienced pilots deny anybody could fly such a huge plane so low without crashing. How could anyone fly a 60-ton, 125-foot wide, 44-foot tall plane through this obstacle course? Moreover, only military aircraft are allowed in the prohibited area surrounding our nation's military command and control center, or legislature and the Supreme Court. How could our entire mega-billion-dollar military, with the ultimate in satellite, radar, radio equipment, and aircraft, fail to protect Washington and the Pentagon? While most Americans were demanding retaliation against Osama, a few people in cyberspace were complaining that something was strange about this attack, and perhaps we should not believe our government. In January, Eric Hufschmid realized that the World Trade Center towers and Building 7 did not merely fall down. For example, virtually all of the concrete in the towers had been pulverized into dust. He posted documents on the internet explaining that the towers appear to have been destroyed with explosives. Meanwhile, in France, a man named Thierry Meyssan was analyzing the odd aspects of the Pentagon attack. For example, where is the over 60 tons of engines, fuselage, luggage, seats, and more from Flight 77? Not on the grass. A helicopter view shows very few pieces of anything, far less than is left in every other 757 crash. No seats, no luggage, no bodies. Nothing but bricks and limestone. Here we can see intact cable spools. Why don't we see the big parts of the plane that are left in all other crashes? These are not pieces of a 757. There are no skid or crash marks on the ground, so the plane did not hit the ground first. These people are gathering small objects. Where are the engines or tail section, the large pieces from the aircraft? There are no passengers. There are no seats. There is no luggage. There's a lot of rubble inside the Pentagon, including intact chairs, desks, even an unburned book, but no luggage, airline seats, or any of the large parts that usually survive such crashes. This dog was searching for people, but there are no photos of it finding any of the passengers. The commonly available photos and news reports do not provide any evidence that Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. Meyssan concluded that the military was lying about Flight 77 crashing into the Pentagon. None of the photos or news reports show any evidence that supports the government's theory that a few Arabs conspired to crash Flight 77 into the Pentagon. In March 2002, news had reached American internet sites that Meyssan could not find any evidence of Flight 77 in any of the photos or news reports. From the evidence available at that time, Meyssan believed a truck bomb had exploded in front of the building. In order to kill that story, the military released 5 images from a security camera in front of the Pentagon. These images show an object flying into the Pentagon. This put an end to the accusations that a truck bomb had exploded in front of the building. It is ironic that these images prove the government spin doctors lied about not having video of whatever hit the Pentagon. Second, it is obvious that whatever hit the Pentagon was not big enough to be a Boeing 757, 130 feet long with a wingspan 120 feet wide. In this picture, you can see the trail of a missile heading toward the Pentagon. The FBI will not release this confiscated video from the security cameras from a nearby gas station, hotel, and other buildings. The only conclusion possible is that the government is hiding something. After analyzing the newly released surveillance photos, Meyssan published another book concluding that a drone hit the Pentagon. In September 2002, Eric Hufschmid released his book, Painful Questions, which shows that both the World Trade Center towers and Building 7 were demolished with explosives. It takes 2 weeks to 2 months to properly plan and place explosives for a demolition. If explosives were used, those explosives had to have been placed before the attack. Hufschmid also shows that many of the phone calls from the passengers must have been faked, since scientific tests prove that cell phones will not work above 8,000 feet. Hufschmid's logical conclusion is that the terrorists were just patsies in an incredible scam. Books like these are often debunked as conspiracy theories. Dave Von Kleist, in his Power Hour radio show, has stated that there is a huge amount of evidence that Flight 77 did not hit the Pentagon. The government story that Flight 77 hit the Pentagon is more likely to be the real conspiracy theory. The first image from the Pentagon security camera shows a trail of white smoke only slightly above the ground. The second image shows an erupting giant bright fireball. The third image and following 2 show the fireball becoming darker and larger while rising upward. The building is still standing, with all floors intact until approximately 20 minutes after the impact when, As the firefighters were putting out the fire, a section of the building collapsed from the fire. Remember, there were no skid marks on the lawn, so whatever hit the Pentagon had to hit it above the ground floor. A 757 is 44 feet tall and 125 feet wide, yet all floors of the Pentagon are still holding, and there is no damage at all where the wings should have hit. Compare this to the holes made by the wings of the aircraft that hit the World Trade Towers. Returning to the first image, there are no airplane parts visible. The roof of the Pentagon reached 77 feet, and the edge of the roof was almost 72 feet. Flight 77, a Boeing 757, was 155 feet long. A Boeing 757 is twice as long as the building is tall. Since we know where the plane hit the building, we can accurately scale our model to the correct size. It was 44 feet from the top of the tail to the bottom of the exhaust, more than half the height of the Pentagon. Mason and others have failed to figure out where such a large plane could be hiding in this image. The only hiding place is the rectangular post, but the post is not large enough to hide a 757. Let's zoom in on that upper right corner. These low-quality video images are grainy, but there is nothing close to being big enough to be a Boeing 757. Passenger jets do not leave white trails except at very high altitude where the water in the exhaust turns to ice crystals. The white smoke trail in this frame appears to be the visible exhaust trail of a missile, a rocket, not the nearly invisible exhaust of a jet engine at ground level. Only people who do not know about jet engines and rockets would insist that a Boeing 757 created that white trail. If you look closely just above the rectangular post, you can see what appears to be a tail and fuselage of a much smaller aircraft. Was the aircraft a drone such as a Global Hawk? It seems highly probable that whatever it was had a missile fired at it from the Pentagon's defense system. What about the witnesses who supposedly saw Flight 77?
No doubt about it, it was American Airlines slammed right into the building.
Many of the eyewitness accounts conflict. Why do other eyewitnesses say the object they saw was a much smaller aircraft than a Boeing 757? How can anybody be certain about an aircraft flying close by at 400 miles per hour? How did Flight 77 get to the Pentagon? This is another suspicious aspect of the attack. The plane vanished from air traffic controllers near Ohio, as shown by the question mark. Air traffic controllers immediately called the Air Force for help. Less than an hour later, an unidentified blip appeared out of nowhere on the radar screen near the Pentagon. Supposedly, Flight 77 traveled all the way from Ohio to the Pentagon without the help of any of the air traffic controllers and without being seen by the Air Force or on any radar screens, even though they were all looking for it. The Air Force did not find this plane either, even though they have their own radar system and were on high alert after the two planes had hit the trade towers. In the 12 months preceding 9/11, our Air Force successfully intercepted commercial and private aircraft 67 times with a 100% success rate. All of those interceptions took less than 20 minutes total time. Yet on September 11th, the Air Force failed 4 times in a row, 3 times after the first hijacked aircraft hit the first tower. Remember that these very large, easy-to-see on radar planes had entered closely watched prohibited airspace. None of the alleged hijackers were good pilots, according to the flight schools. The person accused of flying into the Pentagon was failing his courses at the Arizona Flight School, but he continued to pay for training anyway. The New York Times quotes one employee. He didn't care about the fact that he couldn't get through the course. I'm still to this day amazed that he could have flown into the Pentagon. He could not fly at all. At 30,000 feet above the clouds, just finding New York or Washington is difficult without assistance from air traffic controllers. Yet these poorly trained, inept pilots executed perfect, highly skilled direct flight paths to their targets. This is the cockpit of a 757. No one can see through the clouds below. The terrorists received financial support from unknown people. But why would those mystery people not care that these terrorists were failing as pilots? The 9/11 Commission report tells us that finding out how and who financed them is not important. That's like saying the general giving the orders is not important. Captain Russ Wittenberg was a pilot for the Air Force, Pan Am, and United Airlines. He flew both the 757 and the 767 airplanes that were hijacked on September 11th, so he knows how much practice is needed to fly those planes. He is one of several pilots who doubt the terrorists could have flown these planes so accurately into such small targets. He also doubts that these pilots, ex-military known as men who could handle themselves in a fight, would give up the cockpit to a couple of guys with razor blades, since that would put everybody in danger, not just a couple of hostages. Remember, the hijackers were so dumb and clumsy that their instructors said they could not fly at all. Wittenberg expected that the pilots would at least follow standard operating procedure and switch their transponders to the code indicating a hijack in progress immediately when they learned of the hostages, before the hijackers got into the cockpit. Many pilots and flight school instructors find it difficult to believe that anyone could execute the high-precision, high-speed turns, much less these flight school flunkouts. Daniel Hopsicker shows that the flight school in Venice, Florida, had connections to the CIA and was operated by an ex-con from Holland. Let's now consider the pilot's risky approach to the Pentagon. The Pentagon is surrounded by tall buildings, trees, and highways. It would be foolish for a poorly skilled terrorist to fly only inches above the ground. It would be best to remain a few hundred feet above the ground and then dive into the Pentagon. The orange arrow shows the direction he was flying when he crashed. This photo makes it easier to realize that the surest way to crash into the Pentagon is to dive into it while aiming for the center of the 5 rings, unless the Pentagon has a defensive missile system. The released photos show a missile fired at an aircraft. If the attacking aircraft had come in high, it would have been blown out of the sky long before it got close. Therefore, the terrorists decided to fly along the ground like a cruise missile to avoid being shot down. How did they know? The additional problem and coincidence with hitting this particular area was that his plane was coming from another direction, so he had to make a 270-degree turn in order to hit that side of the Pentagon, the only empty section of the Pentagon due to renovation. It would have been easier to hit Donald Rumsfeld's office, the side it was originally heading for. The risky, acrobatic maneuvers of this airplane is enough to convince most people that no human was in control of it. It is doubted that even the best Air Force pilot could fly a 757 a few inches above obstacles at 400 miles per hour. But the piloting system used by cruise missiles and drone aircraft can. Flight 77 looks small in this computer simulation because the Pentagon is the largest office building in the world. More than 20,000 people work there. Many cities do not have as many people as this building. The high concentration of people means that crashing an airplane into the Pentagon could kill thousands of people. Yet the terrorists hit the only portion of the building that was almost completely empty because it was being renovated. If the terrorists crashed into any other area of the Pentagon, thousands more may have died. Furthermore, one of the purposes of the renovation was to increase the strength of the windows and walls to make them better able to withstand an attack. Intended or not, this was a perfect, full-blown test of 1. A cruise missile-like system, 2. The Pentagon's defensive systems, and 3. The fortification methods being used to strengthen the Pentagon. To summarize, the pilot knew he had to take a tremendous risk by flying only inches above the ground at 400 miles per hour, then did a spectacular 270-degree turn to hit the strongest part of the Pentagon with the fewest number of people in it. One amazing coincidence after another. These terrorists hit the trifecta, then went unbelievably out of their way to squander most of their winnings. The shuttle shattered 40 miles above Texas while traveling perhaps 12,000 miles per hour. Pieces of the shuttle and the astronauts were found over hundreds of square miles. By comparison, the passengers and debris from Flight 77 were confined to a very tiny area. But where are the pieces? There were only 7 astronauts, but pieces of their bodies were found. There were 64 people on Flight 77, but there is no sign of their bodies, or even their blood. This area is the corridor between rings. There is nothing in this rubble that looks like Flight 77 or pieces of luggage. This hole was supposedly created by Flight 77, but nothing in the rubble would support such a theory. Another photo of building materials and office furniture, not pieces of airplane. Inside the offices, the only rubble we find is construction material. There are only a few photos that show scraps that appear to be from an airplane. For example, this is supposedly a piece of the skin of Flight 77. However, this metal is too thin to belong to such a large airplane. Look at a blade of grass to see how small this piece is. Too small to come from a 757. Captain Russ Wittenberg, who flew 757s among other planes, took this photo to an airport to figure out which part of the plane this scrap came from. He couldn't. These planes are 155 feet long and 60 tons when empty. The engines are 9 feet in diameter, and they have heavy steel components. The small figure next to the engines is a 6-foot-tall man to show how large these engines are. The landing gear also contains massive metal components. Even if this scrap belongs to Flight 77, where is the rest of the airplane? How can 60 tons of metal disappear? Airplanes do not vaporize. Flight 77 also had several tons of people, freight, and luggage. Where are they? We see intact books, desks, and office furniture. This delicate scrap looks like it belongs to a Global Hawk or similar-sized drone or cruise missile, not a Boeing 757. The circular object behind the firefighter is supposedly part of the engine of Flight 77. Only one of these engine objects was found, but Flight 77 had 2 large engines, not one small engine. Some say it is a part of the 757's auxiliary power unit, but it is not the right size for that either. Is it a coincidence that a Global Hawk-type aircraft has just one small engine approximately this size? This piece of landing gear was found inside the Pentagon, too small for a 757. This tire rim was also found inside. While it is the correct type for a 757, it appears to be too small. In no way does this debris prove that Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. A Global Hawk, or drone, also has tires and landing gear. Here's another thin piece of metal that would fit better on a Global Hawk or smaller aircraft than a 757. Furthermore, a 757 would leave in excess of 60 tons of scrap, as opposed to merely a few small pieces. These tiny scraps of aircraft would make sense if a smaller aircraft like a Global Hawk crashed into the Pentagon, because the Global Hawk was designed to be extremely lightweight. One reason for its low weight is to reduce the power requirements of the engine, which in turn reduces the noise and heat from the engine. This makes it difficult for people to hear it or pick it up on radar or with infrared sensors. A Global Hawk is like a carbon fiber eggshell with an engine. Christopher Bolin of the American Free Press spoke with Steve Riskus, who saw the plane hit the Pentagon and took these photos of the fire before the firefighters arrived. Steve said the plane flew by his windshield, but he did not hear much noise. This is evidence that a Global Hawk or similar quiet aircraft hit the Pentagon. By comparison, the first plane to crash into the World Trade Center was recorded on video because a cameraman heard the incoming plane before it reached the North Tower. The microphone of his video recorder also picked up the screaming sound of its engines. However, that plane never came closer to him than about 1,000 feet, whereas the craft that hit the Pentagon flew only inches above the cars. A video available at Blockbuster shows the first airplane hitting the North Tower. The video is called 9/11, the filmmaker's commemorative edition. Here is a sample of it. That airplane never came closer to the ground than about 1,000 feet, but we can clearly hear it. If a Boeing 757 flew 400 miles per hour only inches above the cars, the noise would have been deafening. People would have also felt the turbulence from the wings and the vibrations and hot exhaust from the engines. In some respects, this photo resembles those from other disasters. Specifically, most of the people are dressed to deal with fire, or they have gloves and work boots. There are no secretaries in business attire, nor are there any children. However, a few photos show executives wandering around among the firefighters. Who are these two guys? Why are they collecting material from the crime scene? They do not have gloves on, nor work boots. They are holding the parts away from their bodies. Are they worried about getting their clothes dirty? Why are they walking around in the firefighting foam, water, human body parts, and sharp scraps of metal? Why are they so eager to help clear up the crime scene that they rushed out amongst the firefighters to help pick up a few scraps? Are these the FBI investigators? If so, why didn't they let the workers with gloves and boots collect the debris? A Boeing 757 would leave some 60 tons of material, in which case these two guys would not be able to contribute anything significant to the cleanup. However, if a Global Hawk crashed into the Pentagon, there would be only 4 tons of parts or less to clear up. Furthermore, since more than 50% of a Global Hawk is carbon fiber and resin rather than aluminum, if most of the non-metallic material burned, there would be less than 2 tons of scrap. This would explain the mystery of why so little remains. An unmanned Global Hawk has aluminum in the fuselage and wings. Any large pieces of aluminum would have to be hidden because they would not look like pieces of a Boeing 757. Is it not odd that some guys carried away a large box hidden behind a tarp? Why would these people carry away this secret item? What is inside this box, and where did they take it? Why the secrecy if the military has nothing to hide? As if there were not already a number of strange aspects regarding the debris, a news helicopter shows a line of people picking up small items from the grass. Who are these people? They are neither firefighters nor police officers. Why are they prematurely removing evidence from a crime scene? This very rapid cleanup also happened at the World Trade Center and the crash site of Flight 93. The cleanup crews were on site immediately, removing evidence before it could be examined by investigators. At the Pentagon, those involved in clearing up the crash site were top executives. This is like the board of directors at a Fortune 500 company turning out to help the janitors clean up the toilets on the shop floor. If a Global Hawk crashed into the Pentagon, the pieces of carbon fiber would have to be picked up quickly because if somebody had found a piece of it, he would have announced, "Hey, this is no American Airlines flight. We just got hit by some high-tech aircraft," and the Bin Laden scenario would have become a non-starter. Could it be the reason Flight 77 vanished from radar near Ohio was because it landed at a military base in the area, and then another plane, such as a Global Hawk, may have been sent up to replace it? In 1962, based on information provided under the Freedom of Information Act, a military operation called Operation Northwoods planned to take a civilian aircraft, replace it with a drone, shoot it down, and then blame the incident on the Cubans in order to spur the American people to go to war. Sound familiar? Since a global hawk can fly above 60,000 feet, it could fly from Ohio to the Pentagon above commercial airplanes' flight paths. Since it is small and more than 50% carbon fiber, it is not as noticeable on radar as commercial airplanes, especially when flying at 60,000 feet. This would explain why the air traffic controllers never noticed it on their radar as it traveled to the Pentagon. Or maybe it took off from another field close by? A global hawk also flies at 400 miles per hour, which is the speed the military claims Flight 77 was flying when it allegedly hit the Pentagon. Seismic sensors are buried around the world for measuring earthquakes and other events. These devices are so sensitive that many of them picked up the impact vibrations of the airplanes as they crashed into the World Trade Center and the crash in Pennsylvania. They also picked up the collapse of the towers and the collapse of Building 7. What was so different about the Pentagon crash that seismic sensors did not record vibrations from an airplane crashing into the Pentagon? Scientists who analyzed the data reported, "Despite detailed analysis of the data, we could not find a clear seismic signal. A seismic station near the Pentagon does not show any clear sign of an airplane crash. A different station shows a blip that might be an airplane crash at 9:39, and a third station shows absolutely nothing." The blip in the middle graph, which is colored red to make it more visible, appears to be a possible airplane crash. But the scientists who analyzed the data claimed that it occurred at too high a frequency. If it was not an airplane crash, what was it? Another ongoing operation? 6 global hawks were built as of December 2002. If one of them crashed into the Pentagon, there should be one less in the inventory. Reporter Christopher Bolin spoke with the Air Force in December 2002, and they admitted that 2 global hawks were lost in ongoing operations. Not surprisingly, the Air Force refused to explain what those ongoing operations meant. As previously mentioned, Flight 77 vanished from air traffic controllers' radar screens near Ohio. Nearly an hour later, it was noticed on radar near Washington, D.C. It was dropping from a high altitude. CBS News describes it as a downward spiral, turning almost a complete circle. How do we explain the sudden appearance on radar of Flight 77? Could it have been one of those missing global hawks or a similar drone aircraft and not Flight 77? If a global hawk flew from Ohio to the Pentagon above 60,000 feet, it would not be easy to see on radar until it descended to below 10,000 feet. Flight 77 allegedly dropped a treetop level and headed toward the Pentagon. But where are the witnesses who heard the tremendous roar of its jet engines? The lack of noise suggests that this was not Flight 77 at all, but instead one of those missing global hawks, which are very quiet. As the global hawk crossed into Pentagon property, a missile may have been fired at it. Does the Pentagon have missiles in its security system? The missile would have shattered the global hawk and incinerated its carbon fiber. But just in case small pieces survived, people would have to check for scraps. The fuselage of a drone has an aluminum frame, so if a large piece of it survived, it would also have to be concealed. While a global hawk and a missile can explain what happened at the Pentagon, where are the passengers and crew of Flight 77? Before trying to answer that question, consider that the bodies of the Pentagon employees who died in the attack were shipped to a morgue in Virginia, and then we were told they were shipped to a morgue in Dover, Delaware, which undertook the final autopsies. Why the shuffling of dead bodies? Next, consider that dental records, DNA analysis, and other methods were used at Dover, Delaware to identify the body parts, and the investigators claim to have identified body parts of the passengers of Flight 77. If Flight 77 landed near Ohio, the passengers' bodies could then have been shipped to the morgue in Dover, Delaware, at the same time the dead Pentagon employees were also being shipped to Dover. The people in Dover would never realize that the bodies were coming from different locations. Building number 7 at the World Trade Center was a 47-story building with a steel frame. No airplane crashed into it, nor did the towers fall onto it. However, this building disintegrated on September 11th. This satellite image shows the World Trade Center about a year before the attack. Building 7 is the tall building at the top. Building number 1 is the North Tower. You can distinguish it from the South Tower by its antenna. Buildings 4, 5, and 6 were office buildings. Building 3 was a hotel. The attack on September 11th destroyed all 7 of these buildings, and it damaged surrounding buildings as well. Here is a view from an airplane of the rubble of Building 7. The pile is very small. How did a 47-story steel building crumble into such a tiny pile of rubble? The Bush administration wants us to believe that fire caused it to disintegrate. Fires started in Building 7 at around 9 o'clock in the morning, a few moments after the plane crashed into the South Tower. These fires burned slowly all day. This photo shows the fires at 3 p.m. The fires are not easy to see because they are small, and the air is full of dust and smoke. Nearby buildings and reflections make it difficult to figure out where Building 7 is, so I'll fade out the other buildings for a moment so that you can see Building 7 more clearly. There are flames coming from only a few of the thousands of windows of this large building. Most floors do not have fires, and those that do are burning in a few small areas only. Compared to other office fires, these are small. Why didn't the sprinkler system extinguish them? This photograph shows the rear of Building 7. This side of the building doesn't have many fires either. There are no fires anywhere along the base of the building. Incidentally, in the background of this photograph are buildings number 5 on the left and 6 on the right. Both of those buildings have very serious fires burning inside. The government has never bothered to explain how Building 5 ended up with such serious fires. Despite the fact that the fires in Building 7 were so small that the sprinkler system should have extinguished them, at about 5:30 in the evening, the building suddenly imploded and crumbled into a pile of rubble. How did a few small fires cause Building 7 to collapse? According to Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering, a magazine for fire departments, fire has never destroyed a steel building. So how did a fire do what it had never done before? Perhaps you wonder if incompetent architects designed this building with delicate steel beams. If so, take a look at the beam with numeral 7 spray-painted on its end. To say the beams in Building 7 were massive would be an understatement. This building was straddling an electrical substation for the city, so it had some of the thickest steel beams of any building ever built on the planet. At the upper left corner is a standard I-shaped beam. It would be considered massive in most buildings, but it seems delicate next to the biggest beams of Building 7. As is typical in the design of buildings, bridges, and most industrial products, Building 7 was designed with more strength than it actually needed. So how did a building with such a massive steel framework disintegrate into such a small pile of rubble from a few fires? The Bush administration assigned the Federal Emergency Management Agency to conduct an investigation into why the buildings in the World Trade Center collapsed. However, the editor of Fire Engineering magazine became so disgusted by the investigation that the January 2002 issue published an article in which he called the investigation a half-baked farce. Later that month, both Bush and Cheney asked Tom Daschle to limit the investigation. Apparently, a half-baked farce was more of an investigation than Bush and Cheney dared. In March 2002, the Committee on Science of the House of Representatives held a meeting to investigate the investigation. There were more insults and accusations flying around at this meeting. For example, Congressman Boehlert complained that the investigation seems shrouded in excessive secrecy. Professor Corbett complained that they were trying to run an investigation with part-time engineers and scientists and on a shoestring budget. There were also accusations that landlords and insurance companies interfered with the investigation. It seems that a lot of people were helping President Bush hijack the investigation. During April 2002, the final pieces of rubble from the World Trade Center were removed. The heavy steel beams were sold to China and other foreign nations as scrap metal at a very low price, while the less valuable pieces were shipped by barge to be buried. By May 2002, the World Trade Center site had been cleaned up, and with all the evidence destroyed or removed, nobody could conduct any further investigations into how the buildings collapsed. The editor of Fire Engineering wrote months earlier that this destruction of evidence is illegal. He pointed out that our laws demand that rubble be saved from major disasters so that we can learn what happened and improve our buildings and fire prevention techniques. Our government violated the law when it destroyed the debris from the World Trade Center. Here are some of the government officials who tried to impeach President Clinton. Tens of millions of Americans were outraged when Clinton lied to us about what he and Monica were doing. These Americans proudly boasted that they are law-abiding citizens and that they will not tolerate government officials who cheat, lie, or deceive. Yet many of these same Americans either helped our government violate laws during the investigation of the World Trade Center collapse or ignored them. Ken Starr spent over $40 million investigating the sexual activities of President Clinton. Why didn't Republicans advocate giving money to the investigators of the World Trade Center collapse? Why did they have to depend on part-time scientists and a shoestring budget? In May 2002, FEMA released their report on the collapse of the buildings. Not surprisingly, the report does not explain anything. For example, rather than reveal their story as to how the fires caused Building 7 to collapse, the FEMA report states the following. The specifics of the fires in Building 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Branches of our government spent 7 months investigating the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings, and at the end, they announced that they have no idea what happened to Building 7. If FEMA was a private company, we would demand our money back. Since it is a government agency, their worthless report is evidence that they are involved in covering up a scam. FEMA claims they cannot understand how Building 7 collapsed, but perhaps you and I can figure it out by watching this video. This video is poor quality. It was recorded from the network television news. As with the security video that shows Flight 77 crashing into the Pentagon, no one has come forth as of yet to provide good quality video of Building 7 as it collapses. At the top of Building 7 is a rectangular penthouse that contains air conditioning and other equipment. If you recall, the fires were on the lower floors, not near the roof. Why then would the penthouse be the first part of the building to collapse? How could the fires cause damage to the penthouse without damaging all the floors in between? Here's a different view. And another view. Since no fire has ever caused a steel building to crumble before, there is no way to judge if this dust could be considered typical. The person who took this next video decided to point his camera at Building 7 at just the right moment. If you've never seen a demolition of an old building, there's a DVD called What a Blast that shows how buildings are imploded using shaped explosive charges. This can sometimes take weeks to prepare. Notice that the dust comes from the base of the building, just as with Building 7. Also, the building falls down very quickly because the pieces are free-falling. The demolition charges are placed to cause the middle of the building to fall first in order to pull the outer walls inward. PBS has a documentary called America Rebuilds, in which Larry Silverstein, the landlord of Building 7, explains what happened.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Now the phrase, pull it, which you just heard Larry Silverstein use, is an industry term that means to demolish a building with a controlled, planned demolition. It is inconceivable that anyone would be running around in a building burning so badly, placing explosives in exactly the right places all within 7 hours. In fact, implosions take a minimum of 2 weeks and up to 2 months to plan and place the charges. Even stranger is the fact that the Fire Department of New York does not even train their personnel to do controlled demolitions. They are only done by highly skilled, experienced specialists who plan and test far ahead. Now that you've seen how the building collapsed, obviously these minor fires were not responsible. If so, how did the fire destroy the entire steel structure in such a neat and precise fashion? Building 7 collapsed in the exact same manner that demolition companies destroy old buildings. They use explosives to shatter the joints holding the steel beams together. The explosives are detonated in a sequence that causes the building to fall vertically downward into a neat pile of rubble. Also, when the building is tall, the explosives are often timed to destroy the interior of the building before the exterior walls are broken, thereby causing the interior section to fall first. As the interior pieces fall, they pull the exterior walls toward the interior. This creates a pile of rubble with the exterior walls laying on top of the rubble. Photos of the rubble from Building 7 show exactly that, namely, the exterior walls lying on top of the debris from the interior. Normally, if a 47-story steel building crumbled into a pile of rubble due to minor fires, people around the world would be shocked and want to know what happened. Architects would be interested in understanding what happened so that they could design buildings better. People who live or work in tall buildings would wonder, can fire do this to my building? Part of the problem is that most people simply don't know much about Building 7 due to the extraordinary secrecy surrounding this collapse. We were frequently told of the evil of bin Laden, but how often did you see the collapse of Building 7? How many articles did you find in newspapers or magazines about Building 7? The only explanation for this secrecy that I can think of is that nobody can explain how bin Laden caused Building 7 to collapse. By keeping this issue a secret, are they hoping that people will forget about the incident rather than asking awkward and difficult questions about Building 7? Why the secrecy about Building 7? One possible reason for the secrecy about Building 7 is that it may have been the control center for demolishing the World Trade Center. The 23rd floor of this building was given $15 million worth of renovations to fabricate an emergency command center for Mayor Giuliani. For example, it was given bullet and bomb-resistant windows. There's nothing strange about adding reinforcements to a government office to protect them from attack. In fact, many retail businesses have bullet-resistant windows. However, this particular office had its own air and water supply, and it was designed to withstand winds of up to 160 miles per hour. Consider that when the towers fell down, clouds of dust and grit were thrown outward at a very high speed. The only people protected from that blast were in this special emergency command center. Of course, the city government claims that the entire building was evacuated at 9 in the morning, so nobody was inside this special reinforced bunker when the towers collapsed. This means that the city spent $15 million on this special reinforced bunker, and then everybody abandoned it just when it would have been useful. But did everybody really abandon Building 7? It would have been a most suitable place for people to supervise the attack because the 23rd floor provided an excellent view of the area, and the occupants were protected from the dust and the debris. To make the situation even more suspicious, as explained in the book Painful Questions, the flight paths of the two airplanes that hit the towers appear to have been on a course toward Building 7, as if this building was broadcasting a homing signal. The government's explanation for how the towers collapsed is often referred to as the pancake theory. The report created by FEMA has only 2 diagrams to explain this theory. The first diagram shows a fire, and the next diagram shows a floor falling down onto the floor below it. Supposedly, the falling floor breaks the joints holding the floor beneath it, and then both of those floors fall to the floor below that, which breaks that floor, and so on, eventually creating a stack of floors at the base of the building. The problem with this theory is that photographs of the South Tower show that the top section broke off and fell, landing on top of building number 4. However, just as FEMA did not bother to explain what happened to building 7, FEMA did not bother to explain what happened to the South Tower. The towers did not simply fall down or break into pieces. Rather, as jets of dust flew out the windows at extreme velocity, that portion of building disintegrated. Of feet. Some reached the shores of New Jersey. When it was over, it was difficult to find anything resembling office furniture, chunks of concrete, human bodies, or large pieces of the steel frame. The tower had steel frames on the outside and core. They were not steel-reinforced concrete structures. The concrete was used only as a flooring material. Somehow, virtually all the beams broke apart into short sections. Only a few steel beams that were along the outside of the tower remained connected together, such as these. Here are 2 steel columns that are still connected together by steel plates. These columns were along the outside of the tower. A closer view of the rubble makes it look as if the towers were put through a giant shredding machine. What happened to all of the office furniture? Where are the elevators? And what about the staircases? The concrete, office furniture, and people disintegrated into such small pieces that the firefighters were scooping them up with buckets. Only the largest pieces of steel survived the collapse. Nearby buildings look as if they were decorated with tinsel. The shiny objects are pieces of the aluminum coverings from the outer columns of the towers. The aluminum coverings were shredded into pieces and blown up to several hundred feet away. In this photo, the sunlight reflects from the pieces of aluminum, making them more visible. How can buildings made of massive steel beams and thick steel plates shred themselves into pieces? This is as ridiculous as an automobile crashing into a wall and then shredding itself into pieces. Buildings and cars are made of a low-carbon steel, and this type of steel simply does not behave in this manner. This type of steel bends. It does not shatter into pieces. There should be large, twisted pieces of steel assemblies in this rubble. Perhaps you wonder if the beams in the World Trade Center were thin and delicate, and that fire destroyed the towers because the architects did not make the beams strong enough. However, architects always give a building more strength than it needs in order to provide a margin of safety. The towers withstood storms for decades without any sign that reinforcements were needed. These 2 rectangular columns ran up the center of the towers. They are usually referred to as core columns because they were in the center of the towers. Each tower had 47 of these core columns. The thickness of the walls in these columns varied from 4 inches thick at the ground to about 1/4 inch at the very top of the tower. The columns in this photo are about 2 inches thick, so they were somewhere near the middle of the tower. This photo shows both a rectangular core column and some square exterior columns. There were 236 of these square columns running up the exterior of each tower. Every floor had a network of steel trusses. There were 2 sets of trusses crisscrossing each other to form a rectangular grid. This diagram shows only 1 set of trusses. The missing set would be traveling left to right in this diagram. The purple lines along the right side showed the orientation and location of the missing trusses. Corrugated steel pans were attached to the top of the trusses. Concrete was poured into these pans to form strong, flat, and fireproof floors. The exterior columns were spaced every meter along the outside of the towers. Windows were placed between the columns. The view in this diagram is looking toward the windows from the core columns. The exterior columns were further strengthened with steel plates. The plates were welded to the columns and then bolted to one another, forming straps around the tower. Since the floors were spaced 12 feet apart, it means each grid of trusses was repeated every 12 feet. The steel straps that wrapped around the tower were also repeated every 12 feet. As you can imagine, that put a lot of steel into these buildings. The empty space in the trusses was used for ceiling tiles, electric lights, air conditioning ducts, and other utilities. It is important to realize that the framework of these towers was 100% steel. By comparison, the building in Oklahoma City that Timothy McVeigh was accused of destroying had a concrete framework, with steel reinforcing rods in the concrete. Here is a highly simplified cross-section of one of the towers. It shows one floor of the tower looking down onto the concrete floor. The floor beneath has a slightly different color to make it more apparent that the view is from above. There were 47 rectangular columns in the center of the tower, although only 4 are shown in this diagram. There were 236 exterior columns, although only 16 are shown. These exterior columns were literally on the outside of the building. Many people assume that these towers disintegrated because they were weak, but there is no evidence for such an accusation. Rather, the photos and the descriptions from the people inside the towers prove that these towers were so strong that when the airplanes crashed into them, each tower merely swayed a bit in the opposite direction, and then swayed back to their normal position. Both towers then remained motionless. People inside the towers felt them tilt, but the movement was so small that neither photos nor video show the tilting. Obviously, these towers were incredibly strong. According to the engineering websites that have technical data for these towers, the wind force that these towers had to withstand was greater than the force imparted on the towers by the airplanes. In other words, a strong enough wind put more stress on the towers than those airplanes. So what caused these strong buildings to shatter into pieces? The official explanation is that fire did it. Since no fire has ever destroyed a steel structure before, and tests with jet fuel also could not, how could a fire destroy buildings strong enough to handle the crash of a modern, wide-bodied jet airliner? The only difference between the fires in the towers and conventional office fires is that thousands of gallons of jet fuel had splashed inside the towers. Is jet fuel capable of creating some type of monster fire that destroys steel buildings? Let's take a look. This hole was created by Flight 11 when it crashed into the North Tower. This hole is dark, not brightly colored with flames from a fire. If a fire destroyed these buildings, why are there so few flames? Why are these holes so black? As I describe more thoroughly in the book, the photos provide evidence that the fires were small. This photo is an example. Let's zoom in for a closer look. There is a woman standing in the hole created by the engine of the airplane, and she is alive. On the floor above her and to her left is a man, although he is more difficult to see. Let's zoom in on that woman. She appears to be wearing white pants and has long hair. There is no sign that her clothes or hair have been burned. It appears that there is another woman lying on the floor and looking over the edge, but the photo does not have enough detail to be certain. These women seem to be looking down at the ground. Some reports say that up to 200 people jumped out of the buildings. These women may be wondering if they were jumping into a giant net that the firemen had set up for them. On the floor above these women and to their left is a man standing in a broken window. The Boeing 767 that hit this tower was a large airplane with about 80 tons of metal, people, and luggage. The plane slammed into the tower at over 400 miles per hour. Pieces of the aircraft, flooring, and office furnishings would have flown 2 or 3 floors. Anybody in the path of this flying debris would have been killed. The thousands of gallons of jet fuel that sprayed into this area and then caught on fire would have certainly incinerated many people also. The only way anybody could survive this airplane crash was if the flying debris and the fireball did not reach them. Since at least one man and woman survived, and since they were on different floors, they prove that the fires and airplane debris did not extend throughout the entire area of the crash zone. Furthermore, these people walked to the hole from wherever they were at the time of the crash. How could this woman walk through burning jet fuel? How could she survive fires that were so intense that they were allegedly capable of destroying a steel structure? To put that another way, how could a fire destroy a massive steel structure if it was not capable of destroying human life? Obviously, some areas were not soaked with jet fuel, and as we stated before, the fires were not everywhere. This would explain why the holes were so devoid of flames. We can see this woman because she was brave enough to walk to the very edge of the hole, but there may be other people further inside who are staying away from the hole. We can see this man because he is next to a broken window, but we cannot see into the windows because of the glare, so it's possible that there are other people near him or behind the glass. What are the chances that only 2 people survived the airplane crash and fires, and both of them were coincidentally caught in this photo? It would seem that other people also survived, but we cannot see them. They may be trying to get down the stairs. As is explained in more detail in the book, there is no evidence that the fires in these towers were extreme. In fact, the fire in the Meridian Plaza office building in Philadelphia in 1991 was much worse, and that stood firm with little fundamental structural damage. The fire in the South Tower was so small that it did not even spread from one side of the floor to the other. The people who jumped out the windows created the illusion that the fire was so intense that they would rather jump than be burned by the fire. However, the photos do not show fire in the area where these people were jumping. Rather, the photos show lots of smoke. The smoke and the lack of flames are evidence that the fires were not getting enough oxygen. This would cause the plastic and rubber to create toxic fumes. This in turn could cause people to jump to avoid a slow, agonizing death from toxic smoke. The maximum temperature hydrocarbons can reach in the atmosphere is about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. However, that maximum temperature can be reached only when the hydrocarbons and the air are mixed in perfect proportions. These perfect proportions are reached only in a few controlled situations, such as on a kitchen stove. This produces flames that are clean and blue rather than yellow. Even though stoves reach the maximum possible temperature, they do not melt or shatter into pieces. So how could even lower temperatures cause the towers to disintegrate? Controlled Demolition is a company that demolishes old buildings. They demolished the building in Oklahoma City that Timothy McVeigh was accused of blowing up. They were also hired to clean up the mess at the World Trade Center. They developed a special explosive and technique for using it for demolishing steel structures. They are so proud of this technology that they trademarked its abbreviation. Their British division describes the technology as follows. Our Drex systems segment steel components into pieces matching the lifting capacity of the available moving equipment. In other words, if your trucks can hold pieces of steel up to 24 feet in length, then this company will cause all steel assemblies to break into sections of 24 feet or less. Look at the rubble of the World Trade Center. Is it a coincidence that the entire steel framework of both towers broke into pieces no longer than the trucks that were hauling them away? Only a few of the thousands of pieces had to be cut with torches. Somehow, an off-center fire did exactly what Controlled Demolition does with their special trademark explosives. NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey created this thermal map of the temperature of the rubble. This map was created 5 days after the towers were attacked. Obviously, the rubble would be cooler after 5 days than it was on September 11th. Firefighters sprayed millions of gallons of water on the rubble during those 5 days, and it also rained. However, one location in the rubble of Building 7, with little fire, was above the melting point of aluminum, and so was one location in the rubble of the South Tower. Not surprisingly, smoke came out of the rubble for months. Peter Tully, president of one company hired to remove the debris, and Marc Loiseau, president of Controlled Demolition, told the American Free Press that steel had melted in the basements of both the towers and also Building 7. These incredible temperatures are evidence that explosives were used. Jet fuel cannot reach these temperatures. The explosives in the basements had to be powerful to break apart the massive steel beams. Explosives create very high temperatures, and the heat had nowhere to go since it was deep underground. According to the scientists who analyzed the seismic data, the North Tower collapsed in about 8 seconds. The collapse started at about the 94th floor near this woman. This means that 94 floors shattered at an average rate of about 10 floors per second. This means that the North Tower collapsed as fast as objects fall under gravity with no resistance. Explosives were shattering the towers slightly faster than the rubble was falling. The towers were built by the government, so taxpayers owned both of them. However, somehow the government was convinced to lease the towers for 99 years, and Larry Silverstein became landlord on July 24th, less than 2 months before the attack. He then had control of the maintenance and security departments, and he began to replace security personnel. Silverstein brought Frank Lowy into the deal to become landlord of the underground shopping mall. Lowy is a billionaire who owns shopping malls in several nations. After the towers disintegrated, Silverstein demanded insurance companies pay him twice what the policy stated, on the grounds that each tower underwent separate attacks. What a coincidence that after these guys got control of the World Trade Center, Osama bin Laden decided to destroy the entire complex. The packages of explosives would have to be placed in an area above the ceiling tiles. Each package would have a battery and a radio receiver. A computer would be able to detonate the explosives in any sequence by sending the appropriate signals to the packages. To summarize, the 9/11 Commission ignored the following facts. Building 7 at the World Trade Center was never hit by an airplane and had no significant fire. It was 47 floors tall, constructed of steel, and a different design than the Twin Towers. Yet it fell straight down into a pile of rubble at 5:30 p.m., just like a controlled demolition. The Federal Emergency Management Agency reported that the specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown. Concerning the Twin Towers, in October of 2001, Scientific American told us that they just don't build them as tough as the World Trade Center. Since the Meridian Plaza in Philadelphia burned fiercely for 19 hours yet never collapsed, why did the South Tower at the World Trade Center fall after burning less than 1 hour, and the North Tower fall after burning only 2? This is even more puzzling considering that the Federal Emergency Management Agency has told us that most of the jet fuel was burned in the initial fireball, and recent fire tests by Cardington found that a steel building survived fires in experiments with extreme temperatures beyond the range possible with jet fuel. Moreover, the black smoke means that the fire was oxygen-starved and could not have reached the maximum potential temperature of 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet cleanup crews found melted steel in the basements. Steel melts at a much higher temperature of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Days later, NASA images found hot spots in the building that still exceeded the maximum temperatures possible from jet fuel, but not from explosives like C4, which creates temperatures of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Fire Engineering magazine has told us that no steel building has ever been destroyed by fire, that the World Trade Center investigation was a half-baked farce, and that all of the important evidence was destroyed illegally before the investigation was concluded, some before it began. Why was $40 million spent on Clinton's sex life, while only $600,000 was spent on investigating the World Trade Center fires and collapses? The entire 9/11 Commission spent only $15 million, while all expenditures on Clinton's indiscretion exceeded $65 million. Though some say the airliner's impact weakened the towers, winds from winter storms on the towers had at times been greater than the impact of the airliners. Neither tower suffered any damage as a result of severe weather at any time. The buildings collapsed at the maximum speed of gravity. This is impossible without explosives. Each floor hit would have slowed the fall somewhat, and more at the beginning. The concrete was encased in a steel-framed pan, riveted inside columns of steel beams, welded together in a network with steel bands. Yet steel beams and clouds of finely pulverized concrete came shooting out of the buildings up to 3 times the width of the building at hundreds of miles per hour. This is only possible with explosives. The damage and resulting fires were on one corner, affecting 2 sides. That means that the other 2 sides of the building were unharmed. Building 7 had no impact or significant fires, yet all 3 collapses were straight down. Only the tops of the twin towers should have fallen over, yet the entire building fell straight down each time, as in a controlled demolition. Even though the alleged hijacker's instructor said, "I'm still to this day amazed that he could have flown into the Pentagon. He could not fly at all." The flight controller said, "The steep turn was so smooth, it's clear there was no fight for control going on." The complex maneuver suggests the hijackers had better flying skills than many investigators first believed. We heard at the 9/11 Commission, Mr. Mineta. There was a young man who had come in and said to the Vice President, "The plane is 50 miles out, 30 miles, 10 miles out." This means that Cheney knew this plane was coming at Washington and the Pentagon, and yet no planes had been scrambled to protect Washington after more than an hour had passed since the World Trade Center was attacked. There should have been an umbrella of F-15 and other aircraft over Washington. An F-15 fighter reaches 29,000 feet in 2.5 minutes when ordered to scramble. It can travel 50 miles and destroy a target in less than 2 minutes. NORAD successfully intercepted off-course and suspected hijackings 67 times during the year prior to 9/11. Yet on that morning there were not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 failures. 3 after they knew the planes were hijacked, with those in the cockpits intent on mass murder. Why? Because, as Michael Rupert details in his book, in Crossing the Rubicon, Richard Cheney was commanding NORAD war games that diverted our Air Force from intercepting the hijacked airplanes. A Zogby poll reported that 66% of New Yorkers wanted the 9/11 investigation reopened. Moreover, it found that 49% thought that VIPs in the government knew ahead of time and let it happen. Thus, the final report of the 9/11 Commission does not address many important questions. It is an insult to the victims of these terrible tragedies. Please help us catch the real terrorists of 9/11. Go to reopen911.org or call 1-888-INVESTIGATE and sign the petition